Welcome, everyone. We have a full house today. We have a important conversation on the table today with two very distinguished scholars. We want to first of all draw attention to the fact that to be celebrated today, Dr. Mary C. Boyes from Union Theological Seminary has published a book that we're discussing that has also been awarded the Association of Catholic Publishers Excellence in Publishing Awards for 2026. And Dr. Boyes has, over the years, been indefatigable in publishing on the relationship between Christians and Jews and the dialogue and how Christians understand themselves in relationship to Judaism and to Jewish sources and so forth. And in the invite that you've received from the Oxford Interfaith Forum, you'll have a whole list of the books. We also will place the newest one that we're going to be discussing here in the chat. But it is Blessings of a New Dawn, Reorienting Christianity's Relation to Judaism. Thank you so much, Dr. Schwartz, for coming and having this conversation with our celebrated scholar, Dr. Boyes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wright. And it's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. And it is always a great pleasure for me to be in conversation with my colleague and friend and to celebrate the publication of this really important book that she has written, Blessing of a New Dawn, Reorienting Christianity's Relations to Judaism. So the first question, obviously, in any kind of conversation like this is, Mary, if I may, please tell us, why did you write this book? What, in other words, why did you think it was important for Christians to know something, to know more about Judaism?
Well, to be frank, when I was writing this book, I asked myself many times, why am I writing this book? It was a very difficult task, but it comes out of my passion that knowledge of Judaism and the ways of Jewish communities are absolutely essential for how we Christians understand our own tradition and how we practice it. And this is an impetus, at least in the Catholic Church, which is my own tradition, that comes originally from the Second Vatican Council, which is already 60 some years ago. And to my great disappointment, the vision of Vatican II that's been reiterated and strengthened many years over many years in the church, although not known by many people, has really not been implemented in the daily life of the church. I don't see it reflected enough in my own experience. Years ago, I was caught by a citation from the French bishops in 1973, and it goes something like this: that Judaism poses questions to us Christians that touch on the heart of our faith. And that is very much my own experience. And so I wanted to open up that experience for other people. The struggle in the book is that this depends a great deal on a wide array of scholarship. And I resolved that I was not going to write a technical book filled with footnotes, although I love to do footnotes, but to try to make it accessible and not to make it too long, because I don't think people are, except other weird scholars like we are, read long, long books anymore. So that was the struggle in writing, how to say complex things in an accessible way.
And you certainly have done that, as I'm sure any of you who've read the book can see. It's truly a remarkable achievement to condense so much scholarship and so many sophisticated concepts into a book that is just so accessible and easy to read. Mary, can you focus on the subtitle that you chose for the book and help us understand particularly that first word? What does it mean to reorient Christianity's relations to Judaism?
Well, when I say that it's really enriching to the church, to Christianity, to know about Judaism and the ways of Jewish communities, I'm saying something that could appear to be bland or anodyne. But in fact, it's not, because we have to face the harsh realities of the way that the church over the centuries, all the Christian churches, have presented Judaism as, in a sense, the antithesis of Christianity, or the tradition that Christianity has come to supersede. Many of our teachings have rightly been called a teaching of contempt for Jews and Judaism. So the more we learn about Judaism and correct many of the misunderstandings that have flourished over the years, we really are involved in a reorientation process of our understanding of our own tradition. And that's the difficulty, because it's a long process, and it can be unsettling. So I'm mindful that in many ways, even though I'm trying to say things in an accessible way, there's some radical implications here. My hope is that people will come along and they'll be persuaded that there's a case to be made for reconsidering how we understand Judaism. I'm wondering, Shuli, how this strikes you. I brought you my book, I think, in early November, and I'm sure you stopped all of your work to read it.
I did. I did, because as you know, and as we'll talk about, we've been teaching together for a long time. And so I've learned from you, been intrigued by your ideas, and understood the struggle that you felt in writing this book, and was eager to see what it looked like, right? You didn't send me chapters to read, but I felt the struggle that you underwent in writing about something that's hard. It's hard to do. It's hard for any human beings to rethink something they thought that they already knew and already understood, and it didn't require any more attention. And you are really, almost going so far as to say that it's incumbent upon Christians to do that. I think the most important lesson that I've taken away from your book is, look, we live in an age of such increasing anti-Semitism. It's really alarming and difficult to internalize just how much things have changed, even in the past decade, and to understand very clearly and plainly that while much of this anti-Semitism stems from the roots of Christianity, you show very clearly that anti-Semitism is not intrinsic to Christianity itself. It has grown out of the development of Christianity, which you show, but it doesn't have to be there. It doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's the most comforting lesson that I've taken from your work. And to me, as a scholar of Jewish history, it was also important for me to understand more clearly the ways in which rabbinic Judaism and Christianity evolved during the same period, in some ways in relationship to one another. And I guess the last thing that I would say is that, and a lot of this came out in our teaching together, is just the ways in which so much of early Christian texts, particularly in the Gospels, you see so many commonalities in the teachings of Rabbinic Judaism. And we are so used to seeing Christianity and Judaism as being separate and in tension with one another. And of course, it was a much more complicated evolutionary process in the first few centuries of the Common Era. And for me, for us to study together the book of Matthew, to study in a room of Christian and Jewish students, to me, like, oh, the Jews in the room knew exactly what we were reading. If you didn't say that what the argument was about was the book of Matthew, it just would have felt like Jews arguing about the limits of Jewish law and who's going to be a strict interpreter of Jewish law and who's going to be a more lenient interpreter. And so we are very comfortable with that kind of argumentation. And it's very powerful to experience that with you through the book and through your teachings.
So perhaps I could just say a word about what I mean by reorienting. I don't have this exactly this way in the book, because once you write a book, you have to keep thinking, well, what are other ways that I could speak about it? But I want to suggest that there are 5 ways that I think we reorient our understandings and our practice. And if you pardon a kind of a 5 R's, not the 3 R's, arithmetic, 5 they are, and I'll just name them first, and then I'm going to say a very brief word about each. So they are recalibrate, replace, reject, reclaim, and respect. So now I'll go through them again, just touching the surface, but I hope that'll give you an idea of the argument. So the first, and when I say first, second, third, I don't really mean these are necessarily in a linear sequence, because there's a way in which all of these ideas are kind of kaleidoscopic, and we have to make our own sense out of it in terms of our experience and knowledge. So recalibrate. Most Christians that I know imagine that Christianity happens with the coming of Jesus, the formation of the disciples, the Jesus movement, so on. And certainly in church, it's just assumed that when we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about the founder of Christianity, that the disciples are all, in a sense, at least, if not explicitly, are spoken about as if they became Christians. But in fact, what we need to do is to stretch the timeline of Christianity's emergence and to place Jesus and the disciples, certainly the first generations of disciples of Jesus, all were Jews, and Jesus is a Jew. He's a Jew from Galilee, of a particular time and place in the history of Judaism, specifically the time that's known as Second Temple Judaism, because Judaism, like all living traditions, changes over the years in terms of the contact with cultures and experience and so forth. So one clear thing about the need to recalibrate is that, generally speaking, at least theologically, Christian teachers and preachers talk about Judaism as implicitly as obsolete, as it, in a sense, its power ended with the coming of Jesus. So that's the first thing. The second is then to replace the framework that we replace, in which our framework usually is Jesus comes in opposition to Judaism to its laws, its purity norms, its rituals, its understanding of God, and so forth. What it means by Torah, which we simply reduce in a sense to law in a legalistic sense. That is, that Jesus sort of awakens people to a, quote, new religion. So what we have done over the years, and one of my friends, Phil Cunningham, speaks of reading the New Testament through the lens of an oppositional imagination. I think of this as a needing to be replaced itself by a more supple imagination in which we understand that Christianity is not primarily something that succeeds and surpasses Judaism, but for many years is one movement within Judaism itself. And then over the years, especially the first 3 centuries, there is a process of differentiation. So a more supple imagination, a more informed imagination, so that we understand the teachings of Jesus in their Jewish context. And I'll return to that with one of my later 5 R's. The third one, reject the stereotypical notion of Judaism as obsolete. It's not the religion of the Old Testament or of the so-called Old Testament God. That is the one who's full of wrath, who's capricious and vengeful. That's a distortion of the way that the biblical writers characterize God. And so we really need to turn to more reliable sources, certainly from Jewish writers, but also from many Christian writers. And one of the things I'd like to point out to people is that the world of biblical scholarship is absolutely crucial to everything in this book. There's really, in a sense, no excuse for people learning more, because it comes in the form not simply of technical books, but also videos and all kinds of websites and so forth. And I guess while I'm have the opportunity, I just want to recommend a resource I believe every Christian should have, and I think also for Jews, and that is the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Mark Brettler is not paying me to say this, but the new edition, the 3rd edition, is coming out on the 3rd of August. I've already ordered mine. And when you finish this Zoom, I encourage you to do the same. It's so important to understand the world of New Testament scholarship. And this is a way in which simply by reading some of the notes that accompany the text of the Gospels and letters and so forth, that we get a deeper understanding. So making use of resources helps us to replace the stereotype that many of us grew up with. Fourth, reclaim Jesus and his early generations of disciples as Jews. The most I've ever heard in sort of the average parish is that, well, Jesus was born a Jew. He dies a Jew as well. He lives as a Jew. He is, and so to understand what's happening with Jesus in terms of his teaching, and a recent Vatican document talks about Jesus as the living Torah of God. Now, that's a complex understanding right there, but I think we'd have to begin, if we want to appreciate Jesus as the living Torah of God, we need to appreciate the capacious quality of Torah and what it means to many Jews, and how Jesus becomes a teacher of Torah. And he is shown in the Gospels in particular as disputing with other Jews about its meaning. And right then and there is one of the signs of Jesus's Jewishness. This deep regard for Torah means that you care about how you interpret it. And so that to simply show him in disputation doesn't mean that there is ill will concerned. And then the last of my 5 is to respect the complexity of our sacred texts, to recognize how layered they are. Very briefly, in terms of the New Testament, in a sense, just compacted within, especially within the Gospels, but not only, You have three layers. You have the time of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus in the 30s. Then you have the teaching and preaching of Paul in the 50s. And then finally, the composition of the gospel sometime after 70, perhaps as late as 90, maybe later than that. And each of those has a different cultural, historical context. And so, again, in the assembly where we worship, we hear readings from texts, and very often they're problematical. Just on Pentecost Sunday, that the disciples were gathered in the upper room for fear of the Jews. I have never, ever heard a preacher say that's a strange observation, since they were all Jews in the room. So there are dangerous texts, such as those in the Gospel of John, but not only John, actually in all the Gospels in one way or another, the depiction of Jews, generalizing Jews as responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. So to understand the historical context of the Passion narratives is one of the most important things that we could do. So those are my five, and in a sense that summarizes a lot of the book and how I went about it.
As I mentioned earlier, I've had the privilege of teaching with Mary. Our institutions are diagonally across the street from one another, Union Theological Seminary and the Jewish Theological Seminary. And we've taught other courses before, but the one I'll focus on is the course in Jewish-Christian relations, which we began teaching. And I think I want to just illustrate through that. When this work that Mary is describing through her 5 R's, when this work doesn't get done, what then have been the ramifications, and what does it mean to bring students from each of our schools together to look at some of the texts over history? Certainly, yes, we began with the Gospels, but then what? What happens when certain kinds of interpretations become baked into the way in which we understand the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, the early formative texts of Christianity, right? So third, 4th century texts. What happens when we move into the medieval period? Studying texts together in which the interpretations vary widely, and then going through this process of recalibrating, replacing, rejecting, reclaiming, and respecting one another is profound. It is life-altering. We have no doubt it will be life-altering for the ministry of all of those students in the classes that will serve their communities, varied communities, Jews as rabbis, Christians, other faiths as well, and what that could look like. I know one of the most profound experiences Mary had and I had was when a young woman, we asked students to introduce themselves at the beginning of the semester, and a student said, "I'm studying for the Lutheran ministry." And I sort of heard that Martin Luther said some anti-Semitic things, but I don't know, I've never read them, I don't know them, and I feel that I have to know them before I'm ordained and go out and serve my community. I also remember that moment of reading. There are 3 Crusade chronicles written in Hebrew by Jews after the First Crusade in 1096. Was just profound. I've taught those texts many times at the Jewish Theological Seminary to Jewish students. but this was a completely different experience to study these texts together, to feel together what happens when a religion, in this case Christianity, becomes entangled with power, and then the impact of that power on the common people, in the ways in which these chronicles chronicle the martyrdom of Jews who were attacked by not by the government itself, but by the angry mobs who felt, well, what do I need to go to Palestine to find infidels? We have infidels right here in Germany. And then the bishops who saved some of those Jews. So you see how complicated this becomes, sometimes devastating ramifications of not doing the hard work that impelled Mary to write this book.
So I think our class experiences were more than once real experiences in sort of the disequilibrium that can happen in the reorientation process. And just to go back to the example of the woman who told us at the beginning of class that she was studying for the ordination in the Lutheran Church. And we then, about midterm, took some of the writings of Luther, most infamously on the Jews and their lies in 1563. And she was speechless. Here she is, just months from ordination, and she has just read a text that is filled with hate by the person after whom their tradition is named. And so that's sort of one level of reorientation. And I think I'm quite confident it's changed the way she ministers in her own tradition, made her much more sensitive to how Christians talk about the other. But the other thing that I've observed over the years is that many of the, insofar as we're studying texts in a kind of a historical sequence, many of the Jewish students have some familiarity with them, quite a lot of knowledge. And for many of the Christian students, in terms specifically of texts relating Christianity and Judaism, most are blissfully unaware of them. So what happens very often is that the Christian students are horrified by what they're reading, almost unbelieving that this is really said so explicitly in our tradition. And the Jewish students are kind of unsettled themselves because they didn't realize the Christians didn't know this. And then they're moved by how embarrassed or off key the Christian students are. So teaching this has, I think, helped me to become more sensitive how we talk about our history, so that I don't think it's particularly useful just to tell Christians about our sorry history vis-a-vis Jews and Judaism. I think it's essential knowledge for us, but it's not the point of beginning. I think the point of beginning is to look at our origins and to see the Jewish context of Jesus, of the Gospels, the way that the world of Judaism is the world of the New Testament. Exactly how people saw themselves on a certain spectrum of practice and belief and so forth. But it really takes several centuries before there is a clearer line of differentiation. And even then, even in the Middle Ages and so forth, there's much more sort of movement between and so forth. But at the same time, we Christians have to look at the texts of hate that are part of our tradition. It also helps us to understand some of the dynamics in our own day. And it behooves us to know how hateful some of our Christian texts are, so that we have the requisite humility to engage in interreligious dialogue. So I have really treasured the opportunity to teach with people of other religious traditions. And certainly Shuli and I have had the most experience together. And we ourselves are impacted by it. When we were studying the Crusade Chronicles, and you asked me to read one section out loud, I could hardly make myself read it. But I have to, because it's my tradition. Yeah, I have to take ownership of it. But I also want to take ownership, and I want others to take more ownership of the fact that some really, I was going to say remarkable, but that's too mild. Some radical changes have been happening among Christian theologians in collaboration with Jewish scholars and practitioners and so forth. And I think that there's so much, I find that this gives me a great deal of hope. And hope is harder to come by some days, especially in our world today.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing that I also learned from the experience that I think many of us take for granted, those of us involved in interreligious work, and that is the power of modeling. The very fact that Mary and I were teaching together and had, over the years of teaching together, become close friends, that comes through in the teaching. And that sense, that last R, respect, that it just is a natural part of who we are and what we do. So without really doing anything, we were modeling curiosity, empathy, respect, and that goes a long way, irrespective of the content of whatever class we were teaching. So Mary, I want to ask one last question so that we leave some time for questions from our participants. I know that what drove you to finish this book was something you've said a few times during this hour, and that is, how do we get this consensus among scholars out there into the world? How do we get what we know to be true to have an impact out there in the world? So the title of your book, which is so beautiful, Blessing of a New Dawn, I think you wrote that because that is still aspirational. But how do we make that a reality?
I don't think I can really answer that fully, but my hope that ideas get out there and are discussed and refined, and that when it makes a difference here and there and so forth, it's just immensely difficult to have people's attention long enough to really think more seriously about things. My friends who are on this session know that I'm not the type to quote popes a lot and so forth, that sometimes that's a cover for doing some of our own thinking. But there is a phrase that Pope Leo spoke in the month of October, which was the actual 60th anniversary of the promulgation of Nostra Aetate. And I was fortunate enough to be able to be in Rome for a ceremony in which the Pope spoke very enthusiastically in support of the ongoing exploration of the implications of Nostra Aetate. And he had this phrase that struck me about that the church becoming a yeast of unity in a world of fragmentation. And my critique is, right now, the church's yeast about Judaism is old. And old yeast doesn't make bread. So we need to make new yeast. I'm not sure that that's actually going to work as a nutritional thing, but that is to say there is new yeast here and there, and we need to gather it. And so I hope that my book will contribute to a more effective yeast.
Thank you, Dr. Boyce, for those final words, which I find very hope-filled. This conversation between you and Chancellor Ruben Schwartz is, I think, for many of us, a beacon of hope, given that you have been doing this for so many years and that you've had an impact on students. Chancellor Schwartz asked, what should be the impact of your book, but just your lives that you've lived together, years of experience in the inter-Christian Jewish dialogue. But what we have here is an invitation to a new conversation, to something that we can couple with, like what Dr. Boyce mentioned, the New Testament, the new edition of the Jewish New Testament that Dr. Bretler and Amy Jill Levine, I think, is on the call as well, have edited, have presented to the Pope in past years, and is making an impact. But maybe in each of our own ways, creating kinds of Bible studies or conversations or dialogues, whether they be on Zoom like today or in our churches and our synagogues, our spaces, that each in our own way try to figure out a way why and how this can be done in new ways.
Sacred texts come from the particularities of human experience, including our biases, our distortions, our fears, and so forth. I don't think they don't come pure from heaven. They come out of human experience and all our own finitude. So for us to appreciate the problems in our own texts and to respect the fact that other communities are also dealing with the problems, but for many Christians, because we see some of these problems in the scriptures of Israel, especially since I've become old, I don't really like to say the Old Testament because it's a living text and one that has to be interpreted and continually reinterpreted. That it's just so important for us to understand that Jews too are interpreting these problematic texts, and to begin to appreciate what scholars are doing in trying to establish context.
It's very helpful, Dr. Boyce, that there is a long history of interpretation.
I don't know how to set out a time bomb within our clergy and episcopacy in the Catholic Church. It lies at the level of people's experience, the pastoral, the practical level, as long as we don't reduce practical to gimmicks and, that we could see that being practical was actually a intellectual work as well. At one time, Catholic bishops were very much leaders, including here in the United States. My hope is I do some work with the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Relations, and Shuli's part of a group with those of us who have a little discussion group, Jews and Catholics, about contemporary concerns. And the director of that office is part of our group. And so, but it's just a slow work. And to me, it's the virtue of perseverance. I have here on top of my printer, right next to me here, a saying. Some of those people from the United States may recognize its origins. Nevertheless, she persisted. Shuli, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I will add is that, it's slow and painstaking work, and we wish it weren't. But, the only thing I would add is that, it's very much relational work. And, by doing this work with individuals who will be future clergy of all faiths, it kind of it builds that muscle of their ministry, that they are not only focused on the individuals before them, but the other faith communities around them. And and just commenting on Harriet, some of the earlier comments. One of the reasons we do this, you create a study group, you read these difficult texts together, is that it's work that both Christians and Jews have to do. We all have painful texts in our traditions, and we have to go in there with our eyes open to the problematic texts and the implications of those texts on our respective traditions. And there's no more effective way than doing that together with others, which heighten, as Mary described before, it heightens the unease and the discomfort, and therefore makes the reconciliation deeper and more effective, I think.
Thank you for that. And what's the practical ways of doing this, since at the intellectual level has been done a lot on the higher kind of church ecumenical? What are we going to do on the ground to really make an impact?
Very briefly, Christianity exists on a huge theological spectrum. And it's in my tradition, we do not seek the conversion of Jews. So if I seek a conversion, I seek the conversion of Christians to a more adequate understanding of Judaism and an opportunity to interact with Jews from living communities.
Thank you for that. That's really powerful.
I'll certainly add that it is obviously a very large question, but I would just say that learning with one another and learning to respect one another's faiths, part of that respect is respecting the difference and understanding where boundaries are, and it ought not to kind of descend into a kind of homogenization of like, oh, well, we all came from the same place and we all have this view of Messiah and maybe we're all just one. And, that tendency can certainly be there among some, but that's certainly not where we're headed. And that's part of what education's about.
One of the most practical, real witnesses to the inter-Christian Jewish dialogue is what we're doing right now, and that is due in no small part to Dr. Thea Gomolari, who is sitting there with Oxford Interfaith Forum. She is so humble, she doesn't even write her name, but she is behind all of the organization, reaching out to Dr. Boyce, reaching out to others, getting Chancellor Ruben Schwartz to be a respondent, bringing us all together. I work with her closely, and she just is unstoppable in her love for these conversations and her hope-filled labors. And Thea, thank you for bringing us together and giving us a moment where we could have such a beautiful meeting of the minds between Dr. Boyce and Dr. Ruben Schwartz. I wish you all a good rest of the day wherever you are.
I just want to thank you, Thea.
Yes, thank you very